Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are watching from. So here we are again for another Thursday Q&A, and today's topic is ask us about legal essentials for international nurses. So today we have our Director of Legal Services, Ann Rose Johnson Lewis, and our Director of Case Management, Irma Marcelo. So Ann Rose, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are joining us today. Thank you, CJ, for the introduction. As CJ said, my name is Ann Rose Johnson Lewis, Director of Legal Services here at Worldwide Health Staff Solutions, and I'm based in our U.S. office in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm also joined by Irma Marcelo, who is the Director of Case Management, and Irma sits in our Philippines office. So today we have a brief overview that we would like to share with you about the process for international nurses. And of course, primarily our focus here is registered nurses. We do partake in sponsorship of visas for medical lab technologists. And we also do some TN visas for nurses. And then we also process visas for what we deemed as unskilled workers. And primarily that is for nursing assistants. So the overview process, of course, is with the visa is the different entities that we have to sometimes engage with. And that, of course, starts with the US Department of Labor. And that function of that entity is to provide us with the prevailing wage application. And that document will, of course, determine what wage the employer has to pay each and every one of the nurses that will be offered a job. And then the other agency that, if anyone who's gone through this process is very familiar with is United States Customs and Immigration Services, commonly referred to as the USCIS. And then, of course, we have the National Visa Center. And then, of course, the Department of State, who processes the visas and does the interviews and ultimately issues the visa. Once that visa is in hand, then the nurses, of course, will travel to the US. And prior to them arriving to the US, they would be working with their case manager to have them be prepared as far as their licensure is concerned, working with the different licensure boards across the United States. Every state has a different requirement for their licensure. So, of course, the respective our licensure team along with our relocation team. And of course, your case manager will assist you with whatever is necessary for that particular state where the nurses will be assigned. Okay. So, our H 1B visa process is commonly referred to as a specialty occupation. And that is because the minimum that is required for an H 1B visa, of course, is a bachelor's degree. H-1B visas are not available to each and every occupation. They are specialty occupations, and usually they're centered around science, technology, or engineering. Okay, so that is the difference with a H-1B visa versus the other visas that most nurses qualify for, which is the EB-3 visa. And the reason for that is the EB-3 visa, commonly, the minimum education that is required is an associate's degree. Now, recently, we have started offering H-1B visas for registered nurses as a specialty occupation. Okay. And that is not available to every nurse. That is not available to every employer. And that is because of the specific intricacies that is required for the employer to first qualify. And then, of course, for the nurse to then qualify as well. So, a nurse who would be considered for an H-1B visa specialty occupation would have to have at minimum a bachelor's degree and years of experience, specifically working in as a surgical nurse or an ICU nurse, specially trained nurse. And then, of course, the employer also has to qualify um, based on specific guidelines, but I won't get into all that because we only have a short period of time here today and we wouldn't be able to get into all that. But I just wanted everybody to be aware that not all employers qualify for the H-1B registered nurse program, and therefore not all nurses will qualify as well. If you are interested in that, then of course reach out to our recruiting team at recruiting@healthstaff.org. They will in turn review your petition, review your resume, and then look to see if you would qualify for H-1B specialty RN program. Other than that, then our most of our nurses will qualify for the PERM, which is the EB3 process, and that of course is a more lengthier process for arrival in the U.S. That is one reason why H-1B is so attractive to international nurses because it's a much shorter process from start to finish. You could be arriving in the US within 6 months. Okay. The EB3 process is a much lengthier process, and that is because we have to go through and deal with all these different steps, starting with the US Department of Labor, where receive the application from them for prevailing wage, and that sometimes takes 6 months or longer. If your employer has a union, that is commonly referred to as a collective bargaining agreement that protects workers. Those prevailing wage for those locations are taking up to a year, sometimes shorter. And then once that process is complete, at that point, then your application will be submitted to USCIS. Okay, and many of you are aware of the dreaded visa bulletin, and we live and die by the visa bulletin. And right now, the visa bulletin is what we commonly refer to as a retrogressed, meaning that the date once you file your application is not current. Okay, so right now the visa bulletin for EB3 nurses is slated at December 2020. And what does that mean? That means that only applications that were received and accepted and approved by USCIS are being processed by the visa center. Okay. Um, However, good news. That doesn't mean that it will be October 2020 forever and ever, right? Many of you may know that every year, which in October, which is next month, the Department of State, which controls the allotment of the visas every year, will issue a new allotment of visas of 140,000 visas. Okay. So, what does that mean? That means that most definitely that particular visa category will move forward. Okay. Closer to 2024 will that date be? I wish I could tell you. If I could, I wouldn't be practicing law. I'd be a millionaire. Nobody knows, right? Attorneys try to predict. Nobody knows the formula or recipe that the Department of State uses. But all I could tell you today is that that date will most definitely move forward. Okay. Based on past experience that we've seen, right now that date is December 2020. It may move to early 2023. Okay. So fingers crossed. Based on past trends, we hopefully will retrogress and move forward to a date or a month in 2023. And that would be great news for a lot of nurses that are currently in our pipeline and anxiously waiting for their date to become current, because that means that your interview will be scheduled, provided that you are documentally qualified and you have passed the requisite English test and whatever licensure that is necessary. Okay. So, good news on the visa bulletin front. We are not that far away from getting what that new date will be. We're expecting that the Department of State will probably announce that date maybe next week, if not the following week. So, good news on that. on that piece. Okay. The next category for nurses that is much shorter, of course, than the H-1B process, and it is much shorter than the EB-3 process, is the TN visa process. And that is a visa that is available to nurses currently in as Canadian citizens or a citizen of Mexico. And that is as a result of a trade agreement with the United States and those two countries, commonly referred to as NAFTA, which is a North American Free Trade Agreement. So, under that agreement, the United States agreed with these governments that if you have a nurse that is qualified, they will come to the US to work um, on a much shorter basis, a much quicker basis as far as processing. Nurses from Mexico do not require a visa or even show up for an interview. They could just basically show up at the border with their offer or letter of employment, their proof of identification, and sometimes they may ask to see their educational documents to prove that they're a registered nurse. And they basically will be waived into the United States to work as a registered nurse. Unfortunately, the nurses from Mexico will have to show up for interview in their country, and they have to schedule an appointment for that interview that will ultimately give them a visa. But either way, that process for a TN visa is much faster, much quicker than H-1B or the EB-3. Okay. So, what are the difference with those three visa categories? Of course, the H-1B visa is what we refer to as a non-immigrant visa. And what does that mean? Is that you will be in the United States living and working temporarily. Those visas are typically allotted for a maximum time of 6 years in 3 year increments. So naturally, the first visa that you will be issued for H-1B visa will be for 3 years, and then your employer can opt for an extension for an additional 3 years, for a maximum of 3 years. Okay, the TN visa is also a non-immigrant visa because it is a temporary visa. Okay, again, those visas are usually allotted for 3 years, and your employer can opt to extend that if the employer so wishes. And in addition to that, with the H-1B and the TN, while you're in the US, your employer also, if they choose to do so, can apply for what we call an adjustment of status. And what that is changing your visa status from a non immigrant visa to an immigrant visa, thereby giving that particular candidate the opportunity to get a green card to live and work permanently in the United States. The EB-3 process is an immigrant visa because that is the actual visa that is permanent in nature. At the end of that process, you will receive your green card, which is your legal permanent resident card, and that allows that candidate or nurse to live and work permanently in the United States without worrying about extension or renewing of that particular visa. Okay. The only renewal that will take place with the green card will be at the expiration date of the card, and those are usually issued for 10 years. Then, of course, same for the TN visa. You know, your employer could choose to give you an extension if he or she chooses, and also apply for an adjustment of status as well. Okay. So the sponsorship process for the employers is once a candidate applies to our recruiting team and they're offered a job, then, unfortunately, depending on, what the employer is looking for, if it's a H-1B, if you qualify for H-1B specialty RN, if you qualify for EB-3, or if it's a TN, if you're Canadian or Mexican citizens. And then we have to go through all these process with the different agencies that we have to work with. So for this process, technically we work with 4 different government agencies. Okay, so it starts with the U.S. Department of Labor. Then we have to go to the USCIS, who will review and approve all applications. Then the National Visa Center, and finally the Department of State that will issue the visa. And once the interviews has been completed. Okay. So there is a very brief overview of our process for international nurses, as we have a very limited amount of time for this webinar this morning. I will turn now to CJ to find out if there are any questions. If you are listening to this webinar and you have very case specific questions, always reach out to your case manager first. That is your best source of information. Probably will not be able to answer case specific questions, as I may not be familiar with the facts or circumstances that surround your case. So ultimately, your case manager is your best source for specific questions. All right, over to you, CJ. What do we have?
All right, awesome. Thanks for the presentation, and Rose. So I've only seen a couple of questions from the chat. So it's mainly about the application, how and like details on applying with us. So
Hmm.
question is, I think this is for Irma. Uh, do we have any like age limit when applying in your company?
So based on experience, CJ, we have not. That's not the major factor, I think, for consideration. I think we need to highlight that the important factor to be looked at and consider would be work experience, obviously, and then as what Andros mentioned, documentation. So you need to have your NCLEX ready. You have to have passed the NCLEX, right? So I think more than anything else, age is, for as long as a nurse or a candidate is able to execute and do perform the nursing functions. I don't see any reason why age would be a main source of factor or consideration for an application.
All right, awesome. Thanks for that. And next question is, how long does the US CIS take?
Well,
Yeah.
that very much depends on the visa category that the applicant is trying to seek. So it depends on the visa category, and that will drive how long the process will take. The USCIS has estimated timeline for every visa type that they review and approve. So that will just ultimately depends on the visa category that we're being that the candidate is trying to get.
All right, awesome. Next question is from Kareem. Do you offer an H-1B instead of EB-3 visa to avoid the retrogression? And how long does the H-1B timeline take?
So the H-1B visa is available to registered nurses if they qualify, right? And as I mentioned before in the presentation, that particular visa for nurses is very intricate. And that is because the nurse must have at least has a bachelor's degree as their minimum requirement of education. And in addition to that, they must have certain specific experience, prior experience to qualify. So that is a vetting process that will be conducted with our recruiting team, and of course, the employer also has to qualify. Not all employers will qualify as a H-1B RN employer. Okay, so if you are on this webinar and you think that you may qualify and you're interested in exploring that, the first thing to do is to reach out to our recruiting team at recruiting@healthstaff.org, and that team will review your resume and then confirm if you will be a viable candidate for H-1B RN.
Thank you for that. And I think we're done with our last question for today. And this is from Hussein. Will this election bring any difference in the EB-3 visa process?
Well, of course, that is something that is also on anybody who is involved in this immigration space. This election is being watched very closely. And as we know from past experience, each administration approaches the immigration space very differently. Some of them are more liberal, and some administrations, of course, are more conservative. So definitely, whoever wins this election will have an immediate impact on the immigration space, and that's just been how it is in the United States. Each administration approaches immigration differently. So hopefully, we'll just pray for a good outcome and not much change. And if the change, whatever change that will happen, will be beneficial to everybody who's trying to migrate into the United States. And what we hope for as immigration lawyers is that we could get our different branches of government to agree and ultimately increase the number of visa allotments, because currently it is only 140,000 that is allotted each year. And that fiscal year, as I mentioned before, starts in October. And the trend that we're seeing is we have, I think last year we had over 400,000 people that apply for a visa, an immigrant visa, and that is within the EB3 process. Okay. So, of course, every year we have this trend of more applicants, and the number of visa has not changed in decades. So that is one thing that we are pushing for very hard this time, is that we could hopefully get some type of an increase with that visa allotment number. Of course, the EB3 visa is the only visa that is affected by that 140,000 number that I referenced. The H-1B visa is a separate visa allotment and does not count in the 140,000. Many of you may heard of the visa lottery. Again, that is only for H-1B visas. And again, that is only specific to certain employers who we commonly refer to as cap exempt. Okay. Most of the employers that we currently work with that offers H-1B are exempt from that. So it's an entirely different process as well. And of course, the H-1B visa is only 65,000 per year. And every year we have hundreds of thousands of people that apply. So that is also very, very competitive as well. But hopefully, this election will have a very positive impact on this space, which will be beneficial for everybody. Yeah,
All right,
yeah.
correct. Okay, so that's for a Q&A session for this webinar, and thank you so much. And before ending the webinar, so I just want to share this information that please like us on Facebook for any immigration updates and new positions, and we will have upcoming webinars. So, for example, we will have our retrogression webinar in the future with Ron Hoppy. So I'll also put that on the chat, the link for Facebook, and also we'll please, if you have a friend who wants to work in the United States, if they pass the NCLEX and they have a minimum of 1 year current bedside experience, refer them to us. So every uh, successful refer that you will give us, you will earn up to $250. So I'll also put that on the chat. So, and yep. So thank you so much for joining us today in this webinar with Rose and Irma. And we really appreciate your time every time that you watch us. And always please keep updated in your journey in the United States. Thank you so much. And